and welcome back to my YouTube channel. Today I want to show you how we can create a checklist prototype using the number variable. And the way that we do that is by using a count. And the reason why we need to use a count is we need a way to allow the select all component to automatically turn on and off depending on how many checkboxes have been selected. Let's get into it. Before we get into the exercise, I just want to walk through my artboard really quickly. On the right, we have our presentation screen. So we have the starting screen, we have our default state for our filter dropdown, and we have an overlay on the right when it's turned on. And once all the conditions are met and we hit apply, we should end up in our end screen here. On the left, we have two sections. The first section is our component library, and we have all our components here. We have our dropdown icon here. We have our checkboxes. So we have three variants. We have unchecked, checked, indeterminate. We have our button, two variants. We have default and enabled. And we have our spaces, which I've just turned off. And that's how we space our design. So on the right, we have two component sets. And the reason we have two component sets is because we want to control their interactions separately. So we have our individual checkboxes. So there are only two states. We have unchecked and checked. And then for our select all component, we have three variants. We have our unchecked, our indeterminate, and our checked. So this essentially just means if none of our individuals are checked, we want it on 0. If all our individuals are checked, we want it on checked. And if only some of our individuals are checked, we want it on indeterminate. I'm just going to go over here. We're going to look at our overlay. And now let's have a look at our variables. So again, it's on the design tab. Press escape to make sure you're not selecting anything. And you'll see this section here, local variables, and we'll click on this icon. So if you haven't looked at my previous video, I walked through string variables and Boolean variables. And the reason I can tell they're string or Boolean is I can see that icon here. And if you were to create variables, you can see the 4 types. We have the color, number, string, and Boolean. So today we only want to focus on the number variable here. And we essentially need to create 2 number variables. The first one is the count, and the next one is the total. And the reason we need the total here is because it's easier to manage if you were to add more options. So what is the purpose of the count? Is we have 4 options here, and we essentially need to count how many of these are checked. So if we were to tick this one, this count should go to 1. And again, if you click this one as well, it would go to 2. So because there are 3 states, we can just map the count to this button. So if the count is on 0, we expect the select all to be unchecked. If the count is to match the total, so both of these say 4, then the select all would be checked. And if the count is any number in between, then we can just place the indeterminate variant state on, and that will show us that it's neither 0 or 4. Now let's get into the exercise. I'm going to assume that we have this component library set up already. I will link in the description below where I've got these icons. And also, if you don't understand the spacer concept, I've created a video as to why we use spacers. So go check that out. We're going to start by making our checkbox components. So I'm going to go and grab this unchecked one over here. And let's make our component sets here. So I'm pressing T for text. And let's just type in select all. So let's do this one first. And for the sizing, I have Helvetica Neue Light. The font size is 16 and the light height is 24. So I'm going to select all and I'm going to add auto layout. So I'm going to press Shift A. And then what do we want? We want the spacing to be 8 and the padding can be 0. That's all right. So we're just going to copy it 2 times. So I'm going to Option, drag it, and then you can hit Command D to duplicate that command. And I'm going to go ahead and make this one checked, and then this one indeterminate. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to copy this across over here, and we can call this one individual And this is just placeholder text. It doesn't really matter. So just go and copy that text across here and paste it there as well. So we're going to create our first component set. So in the components at the top, you can go create component set. And I'm going to do the same thing for this one. So let's name this one individual. And this one can be all. So I'm just going to use very simple text for now. It's all right. So we want to make sure we name all of our variants correctly, as we need to manage the states. And the only way we can do that is if we understand their names. So we're going to call this, so we can just go state equals default. And the reason I'm writing the word state is because I want to change this variant property 1 to be state, and I want the name of the variant to be default. So I'm just going to go state default. I can go state checked, and then state indeterminate, like that. So now you can see in my component set, we have the property state, and then we have our default checked and indeterminate. So I'm going to do the same thing here. If you want me to show you the other way, I can just change the name here, default. And then I can call this one checked. And then here we see it's still on property 1. We can just go here, edit property, and we can change this to be state. So same thing. So now when I check the name, it should say state equals default. So we have our components now set up. The next thing I want to do is create my 2 filter components. So I'm going to go ahead and drag this icon out here, T for text again, and I'm going to call this one filter. So I'm going to select these, and I'm going to press Shift A for auto layout, and this gap, we can have it on 0 for now because it doesn't matter, and we can make it plus. So we've just added a field there with a plus. And we want to make our first component like this. Let's go padding 16 by 16. Okay, that looks too much. I know my original design was 16, but let's just make this one 12. It's okay. So let's just say this is the closed one, and I don't really care about the size yet because I don't really know what size I want it to be yet. So we'll just leave it like that. So let's go ahead and create our second one. So same thing. We want, okay, so we want these to be in an order layout. So this is a very crazy way of doing it, but we want these elements to be in order layout. So we're going to add another order layout. So you can see right now we have our frame, and then we have these elements as one thing. And now we want to add our checkboxes. So this one, we want it to be horizontal layout, which is okay, but we want this overall component to go down. So let's just go down, and let's just make it a bit bigger for now. That's okay. We can go fix it up later. So we want to add a line like that. And then we want to add one of the select all buttons. So drop it down below the individuals. And we want to copy that 3 more times. So again, Command D. So we have our options here. And then we want to end with our apply button. So again, I'm just creating everything in its default state, which is why I picked the unchecked ones and the disabled one. So we're going to add our spaces now. So we can go, I think we want it to be, so it's hard to do this line 1, but that's good. We want that to be 12 actually, because I've changed this to be 12. So we want to keep that to be 12. I'm going to go ahead and make another one. So just pasting. So we have one that's 8, one that's 16. Oops, let's drag this one up here. We'll call this one 12. Now let's keep it consistent, 12px. And for the color, we can just make it, let's just make it red. And for the height, we want it to be 12. So here we can see we want it to be 12. Another way that we can do this is we can just give it some padding so it's easier to drag it between the elements. So we want that to be 12, and we want to separate that line from this section here. So I'm just going to drag it like this. You know, it's coming out of the frame, so that tells me that this auto layout is fixed. So we can just go and change this one to hug. So I'm just going to drag it in between each one like this. I want the top and bottom one to be a bit bigger, so 16. So I want to separate this kind of section from the line and from the button, and I want to make these checkboxes closest together. I'm going to select these. I'm just going to make this one 8, and that's good enough for the spacing. So what we want to do is in this component set, and we're going to press return or enter to jump down to the layers, and I'm going to hide these by pressing 0 twice. Okay. Go back to our frame. We're going to get rid of this additional padding here because we're using the spaces for the padding. Just make that 0. And there we have it. Let's say we want it to be fixed. We can make it, let's go 180. And we'll make the corners 16. Is that too much? Yep. Let's go 8. Okay. So now let's fix up the rest. So for this button, let's just make it wider for fun. So instead of hug, we want it to fill. So we'll just take up all the space. For this line, same thing, I might go fill. And then for this one, I might go fill as well. So now it's taking up the space, but it's still quite small. So we need to get the text box and make the text box fill. So that's kind of push that icon to the end. And now we have our component set up. I'll just make sure that this one is the same. So we might need to give it more space. So let's bring these two over here. So we want this to change to this one. So I'm just going to drag it out like that. And for the width, we made it 180. So I'll just do the same thing. So fixed 180. And the radii, I'll have it at 8. So what do we need here? We're going to make sure that it is fill. Yep, very nice. So we have our frame 3 within our frame 2. So we want to just make sure we do the same thing here. So I'm going to just go add auto layout. So this is the same thing. Yep. So we have our horizontal in our vertical layout. So I'll just do the same thing. We have our horizontal and our vertical layout. And this doesn't really matter now, but I think it's useful to make sure that when you're creating components like this, so we'll just call that frame 2. We might change these names later. We want to make sure that it's designed in a similar layer so that when you create our smart animate, they can connect really well together. Okay, let's just call this one filter component / closed. And then this one, I'm going to paste the same thing, but I'm going to call this one open. Okay, I think we're nearly good. We're nearly good. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to make sure that this one is centered. So I've dragged it into the frame. And I'm going to use these alignment tools. So align, center, vertical, and horizontal. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag this one in. I'm going to make sure it's at the same height. Yep. Drag it out. And voila. There we have it. Cool. So now we've created our filter components. Now let's start adding some variables. So the first thing I like to do before I even build my variables is to think about what are the type of variables I need. So let's look at this design together. So we need one that controls these checkboxes. And because they all act separately from each other, we essentially need one for each one. So we need one for the select all and then one for all of these options. We also need one to change the variant state of this apply button here. And then we need our count and our total. So before we do that, I'm just going to change these individual checkbox names. So let's just go option 1. I'm going to copy that and then just go 2, 3, 4. This will help us manage this because it's easier to see which one's 1, 2, 3, and 4. So again, make sure you hit the escape button. You're not selecting anything in our design tab. Well, let's go to local variables. Okay. So we're going to create some variables now. Let's create our number ones first. So again, we can just create them and then edit them later. So we have 2 numbers and then we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we need 6 string variables. So go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Let's just call this one button state. And then this one, we can just simply just go option 4. I don't think it really matters for now because we're just doing a simple test. Option 2, option 1, and we're going to call this one select all. Let's just do one word. And this one, we want to call this one total. And this one, we want it to be count. So here are all our variables. And now let's go associate with these components to their variables. So I'm going to go here. I've selected my component. And again, in the change component section, we can change our component like this. Instead of manually changing it, we want to just assign it to a variable. So this one, we can go select all. And we go option 1, option 2, option 3, option 4, and then button state. And if you saw when I was adding them or connecting them, we created this pill, which means that it's now connected to that variable, but it's now striked out. So what does that say? Variable value doesn't map to variant. So the way that we connect string variables to our component set is we got to check the name of our variants. So we have our individuals and we all start with default. So this is why the naming was important. So we got default here and the button, the name is called default. And we can also check it in our layers panel here. So all we have to do is in our local variables, we got to make sure the value matches the name of one of our variants. So again, the name is default. So I can go ahead and write default here. And I'm going to make sure that all of these say default. So now when we select on this, it's no longer striked out because it kind of likes that connection here. So now we want to connect our variables with some interactions. And the best way we can do that is by adding the interactions in our component sets. And the reason we want to do this is because we have this individual component set here, but we've copied that component 4 times. So rather than adding the interactions 4 times, we can just add it into our component set and all of these instances will adopt those interactions. So I'm going to start with the individual component set. And let's think about what type of interactions we want to do. So the most straightforward one would be to change the state. So if we are on the default variant state, we want to change on click to checked. And likewise, if we're on checked, we want to change back to default. The other thing we want to do, thinking about our number variables, is we want to change our count. So if we're on default, we want to change our count to 1. And if we're on the checked state, we want to -1 to go back to 0. The last thing we want to do is we want to affect this select all component. So if the count is on 0, we want it to look like this state. If the count is on 4, we want it to look like this state, which is the checked. And if the count is anywhere in between, we want it to look like this state, so the indeterminate. So let's go ahead and make our interactions. So we're going to start with our default state. And the easiest way to make the change interaction is you just find these blue handles, click and drag, and it jumps to another component. So we can see by default, it knows we want to do on click and we want to change it to this check state. So rather than the smart animate, because we might need to affect a lot of checkboxes, we just want it to do it instantly. Like that. So I'm going to go and hide that. So again, to recap, we want it to change to this other state instantly. The next thing we want to do is we want to set variable. We want to set our variable count to be what it currently is. So count plus 1. So that's our first variable that we've added. So we want to make the count plus 1. And now we want to affect our select all component, right? So we can go conditional, and what do we want to write? So let's say you've added 1, and now it's going to work out whether it needs to be this or this. So there's no way if you added something, would it be 0 because you've added something, right? So we don't need to add that one. So what we need to write is if the count equals to the total, right? So if the count equals to the total number possible, then we actually want to set the variable. So again, change to is only affecting within the component set. If you want to affect a different component, we've got to make sure we're selecting this set variable option here. So we want to set the variable select all to equal to. So we're going to add the quotation marks every time we use string variables, and we're going to change it to this name. So this name is checked. So we're going to write checked here. So again, let's recap this. So if the condition is that the count equals to the total, we want to set the variable, this variable here, to change to this one, which is checked, right? So we'll just leave this for now, but we're going to add another condition. So the other condition is if the count is greater than or equal to 1, right? So we know it's not 0 because if it's 0, it would just be like this. And it can't be 0 because we're always adding 1 here. So if it's greater than 1, then what do we want to happen? We want to set the variable select all to, we want to set to be this state. So that's called indeterminate, right? So we're going to go quotation marks, indeterminate. And that's all done. So again, I'm going to open these two up so we can look at them together. So there are 4 changes that need to happen, or 4 actions when we click on this component. The first thing is we want to change the state from default to checked. Then we want to add a count. So we want to go, whatever the count is currently, we want to add 1. And then our first condition is if the count equals to the total, we want to make sure we've selected it. The select all checkbox goes to checked. But if it's greater than 1, then we want to change it to indeterminate, right? So those are the 4 actions that we need to create. The last thing I want to note is these actions happen from top to bottom, right? So it changes, it adds the count, then it checks these conditionals, right? So what if the count is 4, right? Both of these are true. So the count equal, so we have, the reason I said 4, by the way, is we had 4 options here, right? So let's say these are all on. So there's 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. If the count equals to 4, which is the total, then it goes to checked. But if the count is greater than 1, so 4 is also greater than 1, then we want to set the variable to be select all. We want to set the variable select all into indeterminate, right? So the problem with having 4 is both of these are now true, right? So let's see what happens. We're going to check this component. So I'm going to select this and I'm going to preview the prototype. So shift space here. Before we do that, let's just make sure our count is, so we want the total to say 4. So it's always stuck on 4 because we know we have 4 here. So let's go shift space, right? So we have our prototype here. So, you know, we can click it. Yep. So on 1, it's changed that to indeterminate. 2, 3. So when I hit 4, that should be a tick, but it's not a tick. So I just want to explain this really quickly. So going back to our prototype here, let's go to prototype mode. Let's click on this arrow to check we can also click here to see our interaction. Again, the count is 4, but rather than changing to the checked, it's changed it to the indeterminate, right? So again, the way that we order these is we want the last one or the one on the bottom to be the last thing it does. So the way that we fix this, we close this up, is we want to drag this down below, right? So even though this condition is true, which is 4 is greater than 1, and it sets it to indeterminate, once it reads the last conditional, which is it equals to total, it will change it to checked. So we're going to make sure that this one's always on the bottom. So now let's reset this one. So let's just go back here. Let's just try that again. So I'm going to click on that, shift space. So if I go 1, 2, 3, 4, now you can see the check is on. Very good. I just realized we didn't change that apply button. So let's add that interaction as well. So what do we want? So if the count equals total, no, we want to change this one actually. So anytime the count is greater than 1, we want to change the select all to indeterminate, which is great. But we also want it to do one more thing, which is we want to set the variable button state to change as well. We want the button to change anytime it's greater than 1. So what do we call this? We've called this enabled. So let's go back here. So let's open this one. So anytime it's greater than 1, we want to set the button state to equal enabled. Yep. Okay, I think that's it. Okay, let's check again one more time. So if I select one thing, that button should turn on. Yep, perfect. All right, okay. So now it's on. I can't turn it off, so we got to do the opposite. Let's go back here and let's drag this one back. So this one, again, change to state default instant. Yep, that's what we want. Let's do the count first. So we want to set the variable count to be count minus 1 because we've essentially removed one of our checks. Let's add our 2 conditions again. So if the which one is it? Okay. If the count is less than or equal to, no, let's just do the same thing. So greater than or equal to 1. So again, if it's between 1 and 4, then we want, what do we want? We want to set the variable select all to be indeterminate. Yep. So I want to set the variable select all to be indeterminate. Same thing, again, we want to add another variable. We want to make sure, let's drag this up a bit. We want to set our button state to be enabled. And then set condition. Yep. So if the count is equal to, so last time we had if the count was equal to total, but now we're only minusing. So if you're doing a minus, it will never equal the total because you're always going to be less than the total. So if the count equals to 0, what do we want to happen? We want to set the variable select all to equal to, we want to select all to equal to default. Yep, so let's just check that. Yep, so it's called default, correct. And let's go back to this interaction. There's one more thing we want to do, which is, let's add another one. So if the count is 0, we also want the button state to be default. Because if it's turned on, we need a way to turn it back off. So we'll just make it default like this. And let's just recap again. So we have these 4 actions here. So on click, what do we want? We want it to change back to the state. We want the count to be -1, which is right. So we have a checkbox. We want to minus our count. If it's greater than 1, we want the select all to be this button. So the indeterminate, because we know it's not equal to the total, because it can't be, because we minused 1. But we also want to keep the button state to be enabled. And if the count is 0, which is there are none ticked, what do we want? We want the select all button to be default. So that's this one. And we want our button state to be default, which is that grayed out button. So now let's go have a look. I'm going to go back to here. So I'm going to go shift space. So let's see. Yep. Okay, so if I click this, then that should change to the indeterminate. Yeah, very nice. Very nice, very nice. And if I take this one off, this should be the default state and this should be the default state. Very nice, very nice. Okay, so now that we've created our individual interactions, we're going to create our select all interactions. So let's think about our select all component and what interactions that we need to create. So if it is unchecked here or on the default state, when we click it, we want it to change to this state, but we want to change all the individuals to this state as well, right? So we need to make sure that we control all of these components, but also we need to make sure the count is also correct. So let's go ahead and do our first one. So let's say our select all button or our all button is on default. Click drag, we want it to change to this one. So what do we want to happen? We want to change it to checked instantly. Yep, very good. Also, we want to set a variable. So we want to set our count to total. So automatically, regardless of what number it's on, we want to override it and change it to be the total, which is 4. Yep, so we're going to close this. Also, we want to change all of our individual checkboxes to be ticked. So we're going to go set variable. I'm going to go option 1, and I'm going to type in quotation marks. No, not default. I want to change it to checked. Yep. So we're going to set the variable to be checked. And I'm just going to have to do that 4 times. So option 2. I'm going to have this one checked. Yep. Option 3. And this is quite tedious, but once you've set it up, it's good to go. Checked. And then set variable. Let's just bring this up here. Set the variable option 4 to be checked. Yep. Okay. So we've set all our buttons to be checked, and we want to make sure our apply button is also on. So let's double check. It's called enabled. Let's go back here. Let's click on this arrow. And we want to set the variable button state to be enabled. Okay. So again, let's recap. Regardless of what it's on, we want to change this button to the checked state. We want to make the count and override it to be the total number, because we want to make sure the count is always reflecting on how many checkboxes are checked. We're going to force all our options to be checked, and then we're going to set our button state to be enabled. Great. So let's do the reverse. So we have it on the checked state, and we want to drag it back to the default state. So again, automatically on click, it's changed to the default state instantly. And we want to, let's just drag this up again. So we want to add, so set variable, we want to add the count, and we want to override it to be 0. So when you write a number, you don't need a quotation mark. So we can just set it to be 0. And then we're going to change all of our options again. So we're going to set our option 1 to default. And we're essentially going to do this for all of our options. Set the variable default. Oops, sorry. I didn't pick a variable yet. So option 1, sorry, that's option 3 on default. And the last one is set variable option 4 to be default. And then we want our button set variable. Let's just close these up. We want to set our button state to be default as well, because we always need to make sure that regardless of what it is, we override it back to what we want it to be. So to recap again, so we've done the default to checked and then checked back to default. So from checked to default, we've set the count to 0. We've set all of our individual checkboxes to be default, and we've selected our button to be default. Okay, before we do this one, let's just have a quick check. So back over here, shift space to see this. So we have, we can still select it. So if it's on all and I click on this, these should all go to default and this button should go to default. Yep. And then if I select this, then all of these should be checked and this button should be checked. This button should be on, sorry. Yep, so that works. Okay. So if it's on indeterminate, what do we want it to happen? Let's say we always want, in this scenario, if it's indeterminate, if we want it to be, if we want this to be selected, we should have everything just turn on. Let's just say that. So regardless of how many is on, if in this mode it's indeterminate, if you click it, it will add everything on. So what I've essentially described is it functions the same way as this default state. So regardless of how many things are selected, if you click on this button, we want it to jump to this one. So rather than adding those interactions again, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this component. So we've copied it across. Let's add auto layout to this component set, just so we can see all of our elements well. So yeah, we have a new one, and you know it's new because it has this default name here. So let's just copy that name across. Yep, and we're just gonna delete this one. Let's go delete. And we're gonna change the icon to indeterminate. So the reason I did that is because now I have the interaction already set, which is regardless of whether it's this or this, if you select it, we want it to be fully selected. So let's go have a look. So shift space. Let's see this. So again, we can go on and off from 0 to all. But when we have, only one selected, if I select this button, it should go all as well. Yep. So that interaction works as expected. So now that we've added all our variable interactions, now we're going to connect everything together. Okay, so we have our starting screen again. So when you're on this mode and you click on this, we want you to open up this overlay. So we're going to select this, grab a handle and drag to this component or this frame. So on click, we actually don't want to navigate to this section. We actually want to open and overlay. So let's see that. So let's go shift space. Can we make this window a bit bigger? Yes, we can. So when I click it, it opens the overlay. So that's great. And we just want to close it in the same way. So I only want to close it when you select within this region. So I've selected that auto layout. And in the same way, on click, what do I want to happen? I want to close the overlay. So we'll just close it. And, we don't have to control any of these because they're already set, but we need a way to get to the screen. So instead of adding it to this button, which is on the default state, we want to go to our component set and we want to add the interaction to the enabled button variant. So I'm going to click on that. And there's two ways to do it. You can just click and drag, It's quite easy. And it would just navigate to the screen. Or we can just go here, interaction. So on click, what do we want to happen? We want to navigate to this frame called end. So end, we can add our smart animate because I have this nice animation on. And I think that should be it. So let's go ahead and test our final prototype. So I'm going to select this frame because we want to start on this frame. I'm going to press Shift Space. Let's just move to this open area here. So we have our default state. I can open and close it. I can use the select all. I can also select a few options and I can press apply. And there we have it, success. So to recap what we did in this video, we've created our checklist prototype using string variables to control our variants and a number variable to control our select all component through count. Let me know any feedback down below. Otherwise, stay hydrated, take a break, rest your eyes, and I'll see you all next time.